On the next episode of Painting and Travel, we head north to Grand Portage, Minnesota, where Sarah learns how an Ojibwe Teepee is constructed and the interior space used. Roger sets up his easel to create a painting of a birch bark teepee.
Hi, welcome. We're standing in front of an Ojibwe home, and we're going to do a little repair on the roof part. This is Jeremy Kingsbury, and he loves the culture, the history, and the language of the Ojibwe people. And I'm going to assist with the repair. Yeah. So Jeremy, tell me what to do.
Okay, so we've got to put this birch bark shingle up to kind of make our smoke hole a bit smaller. So it's obviously taller than either of us, so we're going to use our poles here and just kind of pressure it against the birch bark so it'll stay in position. All right, so we'll get that up there. And if I can just force it under there. Okay, so the cool thing about this house is there's nothing sewing it into position. It's all just weighted down. So in the 18th century, during the fur trade, the Ojibwe here moved around a bunch, so this house goes up really quickly then. When we first put this one up, it only took about 30 minutes to go from start to finish.
Well, it's great. And the Ojibwe people have been residents here for hundreds of years.
Yeah, well, I mean, in North America for certainly thousands of years, but like the oral tradition goes back to around 900, roughly, of when they came over from the east coast of, like, on the Great Banks there, and then they just started a long, kind of slow trip west. And some anthropologists and archaeologists guess that they showed up in Lake Superior around 1400 or so. Some people might argue that it was earlier than that, but by the time the first French census and record keepers are showing up out here on Lake Superior, they're writing about people that we can be pretty sure are the Ojibwe today.
Now, Lake Superior, how is this viewed by the Ojibwe people?
I guess the word for it is the key there. So everyone knows about what Lake Superior is called in Ojibwe, thanks to Gordon Lightfoot and Henry Longfellow of the great lake they called Gitche Gumi. But yeah, Gitche means great, and then Gumi means, no, seriously, it's huge, is kind of what that translates to. And then you'd say Zagayagan, so it's like the biggest thing, the big lake.
And this birch bark was also wonderful for canoe building.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, birch bark's waterproof right off the tree, so, and anywhere you poke a hole in it, you stitch it up with spruce roots, the same thing that we use to sew our house up with. But then you'll have to waterproof that seam with a mixture of pine sap, charcoal, and grease. But they're fast in the water, they're lightweight, they can carry a ton of weights.
I'd love to hear about the interior of this house.
Yeah.
Does it have some area for sleeping, and then does the fire go in the middle with the smoke going up?
But you'd have your fire in the middle. The floors are all lined with spruce boughs or evergreen boughs, which keeps you up off the ground, which is either cold or wet. Or I always tell people it acts like your box spring. You know, you wouldn't think that sleeping on metal coils would be comfortable, but if you got a mattress on top of that, it's pretty good. So that's what ours is it got spruce boughs down, and then we'll put hides down on top of that. So locally, they'd be going out to Isle Royale to hunt caribou probably every year or two, so you'd have lots of caribou hides down to be comfortable, and then wool blankets and things you get from the traders to sleep on, or rabbit skin blankets too that they were making. But yeah, so they're pretty comfy.
So you have an all-purpose room inside this house.
Yeah, there's only one room, so it's
depending on what you're doing, you either roll up the bedrolls
yeah.
or roll it out. What was the popular fur at that time?
Well, in the fur trade for everybody up here, it's all beaver. For the Northwest Company here in 1793, they shipped out 183,000 beaver skins basically in that one summer, which is huge. They always say it's a great year for the company and a bad year for the beaver.
Very bad year for beavers.
But beaver are doing all right. There was lots of kind of local extinctions, you know, like where they'd wipe them out of certain areas, but they've recovered now and they're doing great. So they're back to being a nuisance animal for a lot of people. So they're industrious little guys, but they're pretty great to watch work.
Well, it doesn't sound like a beaver is an ideal pet, but it's nice to hear what they can do if they need to.
Yeah.
I've painted some teepees in the past, but they were party teepees, but here is the real thing. I'm going to get started. I'm using acrylics, and I'm going to try and make this quick because the sun is going to be leaving us in a little while. On my palette here, I have titanium white, ultramarine blue. I have 2 yellows, Indian yellow, cadmium yellow light. I have alizarin crimson, and I have 2 earthy colors. This is chromium oxide green and burnt sienna. And I'll primarily be using these 3 transparent colors, the ultramarine blue, Indian yellow, and alizarin crimson. Now, painting outside is always difficult, and today is no exception. I'm looking right into the sun, basically. So it's always a challenge to paint out here on location, but it does come with rewards. And one of those rewards is just being able to see the item that you're painting firsthand. And that seems to be very important for me when I do a painting. I just sort of get a feel for what I'm doing, much better than if I'm working from a photograph. I want to put my darks in first. One thing I don't want to do when I'm painting is get too fussy with what I'm working with right off. I'll save the details for last. I'm using a lot of ultramarine blue and a lot of Indian yellow. Okay, so I'm just blocking in these big areas now. Often I start out with a board that's toned with burnt sienna, and that probably would have been a good idea in this painting, but I started out with a white board, so no big deal. I'll just work with this. I'm just mixing up this burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and I'm going to put this on as a wash right on the side of this structure here. So now everything on my board is covered, and I like that to start with because I don't have that white to deal with anymore, and now I can start to define the areas. This is very blocky right now, just really the big shapes, and basically what I'm trying to do is get my darks in here first. After I get my darks in, I'll start to put in my middle tones, and then I'll put in my lights and my highlights and my details last. Well, we've got a lot of greenery up here, so I'm putting in my cadmium yellow light and some chromium oxide green. That's an opaque color, and see, I can lay this opaque color right over this area here, which is dry to the touch. It's a beautiful green back here. Sun keeps going in and out, so that green kind of keeps changing. I've applied the first layer of my painting now. I'm going to mix a green again, put some white in it, and I'm going to start to build up this painting with the opaque colors. And I'm going to scumble this grass over this first layer, which is dry. All right, with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, that'll give me a nice dark color, about as dark as I can get. I'm going to, with the edge of my brush, put in what looks like some of these small trees here. And I'll just drag this down. You see, this is already dry, so this allows me to paint over this other paint here, and it won't blend in with it. If I were working with oils, this would be totally different, because if I were to drag this stroke down here through this green, this color would pick up this light green and would change the value and change my color. So I would have to approach it totally differently. I'm going to put one more wash of color onto the structure, and I'm going to take a warm color here, the burnt sienna, and mix it with a cool color. I guess I'll just get green. Oh, now we have some nice light. The sun has come out again. Of course, it's right in my face, but I have to deal with that. This might be a good time to put in some of these highlights. I think on the structure itself, I'm looking at that and I see a very warm color. If I had some yellow ochre out here, I would use that. I have some burnt sienna and some yellow, so I'll just make a yellow ochre color from that and make a few of these patches of sunlight coming through and hitting that birch bark. Sunlight is filtering through this tree right in front of me, and that's what's making that pattern. Right here we have another bright patch of sunlight, and I might add more patches of sunlight than I see. And up at the top, sunlight is hitting that quite a bit more. So with the edge of my brush, this is a chisel pointed brush, I'll just hold that there, drag a few of these down. Well, there's a lot of poles on that. Of course, all that birch bark is basically being held on to the structure itself with the weight of the poles. This is very blue in here right now. I don't want that blue. This is very difficult because I'm looking right into the sun as I'm looking at this palette, but I know I need to make this a little warmer right in here. Okay, now we have some darker areas where the birch poles are resting against the birch bark, so that's casting shadows on the edge of those poles. And we have these big sheets of birch bark. I didn't know it could even get that big when they unroll it from the tree. And then this casts a bit of a shadow where this birch bark overlaps. I think the birch on this particular structure has been there for quite some time, so it is quite weathered. Well, I'm going to jump to the negative areas now, which means the sky and the lake. So I'll take my ultramarine blue and white and maybe some Indian yellow and some red. That will just gray that a bit. And I want it fairly light, so I'm going to add some more white. Now I'm just going to try and study that tree and try and determine where some good negative areas can be placed. And what I'm trying to do is describe the spaces between the branches, the trunks, and the leaves. And I still have a fairly big brush here, but see, I can take some negative areas like that. All of a sudden you can see, well, there's a trunk here and a trunk here. Here we have this large stand of trees over here, so I'm going to put some negative areas between all those spaces there. And then up here, we may have a lot of sky coming down in this area. Now I'm trying to just also establish a nice pattern as I go. Now as I put these negative areas in, it doesn't mean I have to leave the negative areas. I can also go back over those with my dark green. This is kind of a back and forth process here where I'll put in some negative areas, and then maybe if they're not quite right, I'll just paint over those with either some foliage or leaves or more limbs even, or trunks. Okay, I see the lake down here. I don't really see the horizon very much. It's really covered with foliage, but down here we have a lot of water from the lake. I'm going to make the side of the teepee here slightly darker and with some blue, because I think it's probably catching some of the light from the sky. So I'll just put a wash of blue in here now. I have a bunch of brushes in my hand here, but I've only used one brush so far in this painting. With my cadmium yellow light and chromium oxide green, I'm going to make a brilliant green. Maybe mix a little Indian yellow with that. And now we have these patches of sunlight coming through here. I'll spray that, and the reason I want to spray it is as I apply this paint while this is slightly damp, this will flow out a little bit and give me a soft edge. A few more patches of sunlight along here. I think a few more poles up in the top here. Some of them extend pretty far up, so we'll just bring those right out of the picture plane. And some of those poles are catching the light here and there because it's a dappled light because of the tree right here. And we'll put some greenery on the side of the teepee here, just so it looks like it's firmly anchored to the ground. So I'm going to pick up a small brush now. The first time I've used a smaller brush. Okay, I had my ultramarine blue, and then I'm going to pick up my Indian yellow and some red again, just because I don't want that blue to be too blue. And by adding those two other colors, it'll give me a gray, because by adding three primary colors, it'll give me a gray, blue, yellow, and red. The negative areas are really what will make this deep woods look. I mean, it's not really deep woods, but it's quite thick with the foliage and trees. Now, if I make a stroke there and I make a stroke there, maybe put another one down here, what that indicates right there is another tree trunk. Even though I haven't painted a tree trunk in there, I'm painting around. In other words, I'm sort of sculpting around what will look like a trunk of a tree. And for branches, the same way. Let's go over here. We'll make a negative area here, and I'll make another negative area there. And you can see by making those negative areas, it looks like this tree trunk comes up this way and then branches off. So I'm not just putting these negative areas in arbitrarily. They all have to really describe something. Now when you get up to where there's a lot of leaves, those negative areas just become really little spots. Now at this point, I'm starting to add some more detail to the piece. One thing I'd like to do is to be able to stop on a painting at any one time and say it's finished to that point. In other words, I don't want to leave any one area unfinished. I want to finish the painting all at the same time. So if I stop here, I can say it's finished to that degree. I don't have any one area that's any more finished than another area. I'm starting to lose the light. All that happens always so quickly, but I do want to add a few more spots of highlight right across the front. And since this is the center of interest, I want to place all my attention, or most of my attention, here. And that's a good place for these highlights. There comes a point where sometimes you have to stop painting in the field and then take it back into the studio. So with my reference photo now, we'll take this back to the studio and we'll finish it there. I'm back in the studio and I've brought this painting to a conclusion, and here it is. But I think I can improve this painting. So I've taken an 8 by 10 inch piece of masonite, start over and just see how much more we can simplify this. So what I'm going to do is just use this painting I did out in the field as sort of a guide. I'll even change the composition around a little bit here and just bring these down to even more basic shapes. The conditions out in the field were very difficult to work with. We were sort of pressed by time, the light was fading, and I was looking directly into the sun. And that's just what happens when you're out in the field painting sometime. But I'll try to use that experience there and put that to good use. And we'll just try and break this down into more basic shapes. And I had so many negative areas in that painting we did in the field there. It just didn't hold together nearly as well as I had hoped. I'm never afraid to start over. If I can learn something out there in the field, I can bring it back here, then there was nothing lost. I have my spray bottle here. We'll keep that a little bit moist as we go through this process. Got some red in here and put some red down here to dull that some. Really got these big shapes working now. Now since I have finished this other painting, this one really just will not take me much time at all to complete. Because I've kind of done all that studying of the object and the subject out in the field. Pick up some lighter tones right here, and this will be some of the foreground colors. I'm always quite persistent when I go out in the field and paint. I try and never give up on a painting. Sometimes they're just so difficult to finish, though, that might have been an option. But then, of course, I wouldn't have been back here right now doing this piece, which I'm hoping will come out a little better than the one I did outside. Okay, let's get some cerulean blue, make that sky. I'll just put this sky in here. So I'm mixing my burnt sienna and cerulean blue. I'll just put more burnt sienna in that, and that'll make it warm. Now on one side of this, I'm really going to change this quite a bit. On one side of this, I'm going to make this in shadow. Now the light was actually coming from this direction, but since I moved this teepee over, I don't think I want the light on this side because that's going to put too much weight over there. So I'm going to swap the light around too and make it light on this side. And we'll put some sunlight in here on the edge of this teepee. I'm going to make this doorway area a little smaller. I don't think they call them doors. Just take some blue there, and right on this side, we'll make that cooler with some blue. So that would be some reflected light from the sky coming in this way. Now the board was already toned with some burnt sienna, so some of that nice warm burnt sienna color is showing through here. See, already I think this is a stronger painting than this one here. This one was just too busy, too overall busy. So a nice simplification of this is really what needed to be done. Let's just add some of those tree trunks now. A couple more over here. I'm going to take my razor blade, scrape off some of this paint, give myself a little bit more palette space here. I'm using some burnt sienna and cerulean blue, a warm and a cool color. This birch bark is rather warm, so I'll just use more of the burnt sienna than the cerulean blue and keep that warm. And put a few indications of that birch bark here and there. I'll just use that same color, put a little white in it, and we'll put those poles right on the outside. Just loading my brush up, and it's just dragging this down in one stroke. I've got it there. I'll lighten that on this side. These poles will be slightly brighter. A few more. There were lots of poles in this thing, all overlapping in different directions. And then where this birch bark overlaps, we can just put a few strokes this way, horizontally. I think this is dry enough where I can go over this easily. These acrylics do dry so fast. I'll just take a light green now and work on this foreground. Put some of those patches of sunlight that were coming and going while we were in the field. Add a few of those here and there. As I go back, I want to change the color of that slightly. I don't want the same color here as I do back here. I want to vary those colors as I go back. Maybe a few warmer tones up front. And maybe a patch or two of sunlight way in the distance. All right, I have this large shape of trees here, this large mass of trees. I want to vary that, but I don't want to lose my large shape because I don't want to get any more large shapes going on in there. I'll just tap in some variations of that color, just so it's not one solid mass. I'll go right over a few of these tree trunks to indicate some foliage in front of the trunk. Just using a fan brush to do this. With the smaller brush, I'm going to mix a warm color, maybe a warm orange. And on the side of a few of these trunks, I'll just put a hint of some sunlight. And then on the shadow side, taking cerulean blue and white, and we'll just put some indication of the cool side of this tree with some blue. On many of my paintings, I put a bright patch of sunlight going across the back. I'm going to do that right here. Just like a little streak of sunlight coming through the trees. Maybe echo that a few times in the foreground. I'll mix up some more color of the sky, cerulean blue and white. And let's add a few more of those negative areas in here. Now we did have the lake way back here too, so I think I'll put in a suggestion of that lake, but it won't show up everywhere. We'll just put that in here where you can just see some of it through the trees. With some yellow and white, I'm going to heighten the look of this sunlight hitting this side of the teepee. Take the fan brush, mix up some dark green, then I'll just flip up a few weeds right here in the foreground. Just touching it very lightly and just lifting it up. A couple right in front of the teepee itself. Let's take with a dark color, brown and blue, let's put one large tree right in front of this teepee. Just to give that a little different place in space. Run that down, and then we'll take that same color and drag that off to the side and create a shadow. A few little branches out here and there. And then a warm highlight or two on this side. It's just where some sunshine is hitting that. And with some cerulean blue, just put a sort of a bluish cast on this far side of the tree. Well, I wish it were always this easy to complete a painting, but really what it took to complete this one was being out in the field, working on this one, working in those harsh sunlight conditions, and observing what I was painting. And now I was able to come back into the studio, process that, simplify it to create a much stronger image.
I noticed in the visitor center there was a display that had these brooches, and are they trading, valuable for trading?
Yeah, it's a trade item.
And it's decorative too?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a bright silver ring, and we see tons of them coming in and being used. One of my favorite things is it's clear that Native people and Ojibwe and Ottawa and all kinds of folks would buy these really fancy embroidered or engraved like gorgets, like a real big chunk of silver that would go around your neck. And before contact, we know they had round gorgets too, made out of shells and things.
I like what you're wearing. These are bear claws.
Yeah, bear claws. So I'm dressed basically as a voyageur guide or a wintering voyageur or a native hunter. There's not a lot of difference by the 1790s in their clothing. And so it's kind of that mix too. By 1790s, you've got this real eclectic mix of decoration. So like we've got our trade beads coming in from Italy, but then on here we've got a pouch that's got, you know, trade beads from Italy, cotton coming from India likely, and then it's still got this porcupine quill embroidery on it to be decorative. So it's that mix of all this stuff going on. And we see that same kind of thing going on at this trade silver, where they'll buy big fancy engraved chunks of silver, and whenever they'd get kind of old and worn, they'd cut out new patterns from them.
So they recycled their jewelry.
Yeah,
It got a little
it's new
old or
art,
bent,
yeah.
and they cut something new out. Thanks a lot for talking to me.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks for the help.
My pleasure.
For more information about painting and travel with Roger and Sarah Bansemer, visit paintingandtravel.com.